I think we need to take inspiration from Turkey. Turks, as a member of NATO, have declared killing Russian soldiers. And the discussion in Turkey was never, and the discussion in Russia, to be honest, was never whether there was some major risk of escalation between the two countries. Because it was understood by the Russians that what the Turks had done, they had done to enforce a very specific boundary of behavior that they wanted to stop, and the Russians stopped.
This is a conversation with Dr. Jack Watling. Dr. Watling is a senior research fellow for land warfare at the Royal United Services Institute. Jack works closely with the British military, researching how can the British armed forces best prepare for future conflict. And he also frequently travels to Ukraine in order to observe and study the development and lessons of the war there, and also looks at Russian conventional and unconventional capacities and activities in Ukraine and elsewhere. In this conversation, we talked about two wars that Russia is currently waging, an overt one against Ukraine and a covert war against the West. Thank you to everyone who supports this podcast on Patreon. And if you want to support what I'm doing, do consider becoming a supporter on Patreon as well. And now, enjoy the conversation. Yeah, we're on. So welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be with you.
Your topic of expertise is, one of them is land warfare. And so it would be good to start with one of our two main topics, which is war in Ukraine. And you go there a lot for research purposes. You've been there, if I'm not mistaken, number of times. So you've had the chance to study it up close. And in May, about a month ago, you wrote that Russia is beginning to compound its advantages against Ukraine in an article that was sounding rather bleak and more pessimistic than I would say most are. 1 month later today, would you still say that this is true?
Yes, I do think it's still true. If you look at the increasing size of the Russian group of forces attacking Ukraine versus the diminishing size of the Ukrainian armed forces, then it becomes the case that even if Russia is not able to significantly overmatch Ukrainian units, the fact that they are able to maintain multiple axes of attack is allowing them to incrementally take ground. If we look at the air defense situation, for example, the fact that the number of air defense interceptors is being depleted means that as Russian production capacity increases and they have more munitions, they are able to simultaneously engage targets on more axes, and therefore they will find the gaps in the air defense. And so we are seeing a corresponding increase in the number of successful strikes. If you compare Russian long-range fires, in the first half of last year to this year, you see a dramatic increase in the number of hits on target achieved by the Russians. And so this is a good example of where you are seeing simultaneously the Russians gain several advantages over the AFU, and that is putting serious pressure on the defense.
The commander-in-chief of Ukrainian forces said, I think this week or last week, a couple of days ago, that the time is actually playing in Ukraine's favor, and its position should get progressively better and better from this point on. But from what you're saying, it sounds like you would disagree, and you would maybe say that the trend is moving rather in Russia's favor.
Right now, the trend is definitely moving in Russia's favor. It's producing more equipment, it's generating more troops. However, that does not continue indefinitely. I think we're probably going to hit the peak of Russian force expansion and equipment output late this year. That advantage will be sustained into the beginning of next year. And then after that, you are actually likely to see the Russians finding it harder to regenerate the volumes of equipment that they need. And so at that point, the number of casualties inflicted and the damage inflicted will start really eating into the size of the force that can be deployed. Similarly, there are things the Ukrainians can do that would change the dynamic. So if they are able to, they've passed their mobilization laws now, if they are able to reconfigure their training system so that they are able to generate those units of action from the people that they bring in, and if Ukraine's international partners are able to line up the provision of equipment to those units, then it doesn't have to follow that the Russian force generation process outstrips Ukraine's. But that is the prevailing dynamic.
I'm going to stay on that for a little longer. How much do we actually know about the Ukraine's training process? Because there was a lot of news that actually it's really underwhelming, to put it that way, and that the training that Ukraine is giving its new recruits and its conscripts is really insufficient, and that that's making it less effective, but it's also making it harder to get more new conscripts and volunteers because they know that the training that they will get might not be exactly what they need. So, do we know if on that note things are getting better?
So I think it's important to underscore the fact that the Ukrainian training and force generation process is fundamentally different to the process used in NATO countries. The way that the Ukrainians generate their forces is that you bring people to their training areas where they do basic weapons familiarization and fitness, essentially. They are then given to their units after a relatively short period receiving that basic training. And if you came out of a training school or depot in the UK, for example, without any tactical training, you would be considered woefully underprepared. The Ukrainians do that tactical training, but they do it in the unit, and it's organized by the deputy commander of the battalion and then deputy commander of the brigade, depending on the size of exercise that they're conducting. And so the fact that that was their process meant that a lot of the time when international observers were saying that Ukrainian troops were receiving no training, a couple of things were happening. Either the unit that they were then assigned to was under really substantial pressure, and so its units were all in contact, which meant that they would join the unit, they would have to fight, and then they would join the force generation training process when that unit got rotated off the line. Or they would get plugged into a unit which wasn't heavily committed at that point, and then they would start doing training in tactical depth, quite close to the front, with the under the supervision of the deputy commander. And those units could receive significantly better training. And so there are some real problems with the way that the Ukrainians do this. One of them is that as more of their units are fixed on the front, they have a limit to the number of troops that they can train based on what the capacity is in each of their units to put on the collective training. Another issue is that, as I say, when their brigades start to take attrition or need battlefield replacements, training can be curtailed quite sharply. So the third problem is just one of how you fit a Western system of training, which tries to release people to the units at a fairly high level of training where they can perform their tasks, versus a Ukrainian system where that is done in the unit. It means that the processes don't mesh together at all. And so the Ukrainian, there are structural problems with that process that the Ukrainians have. Training can be cut short at fairly short notice, but it's not as non-existent, as it were, that a lot of the observers have highlighted, because of what they tend to be looking at is the training in the depots. And there, yes, training is very, very limited. But that's not the whole story, if that makes sense.
I think if I dig a little further on that note, because I think it's really interesting, do you think that because of the factors that you've mentioned, the French initiative of sending French and perhaps other NATO troops, instructors specifically to Ukraine to train the soldiers there, could, because of what you said, really make a difference? And maybe to add on that, one of the criticisms I've heard of the Western training of Ukraine's troops is that not every time they actually train the Ukrainians maybe what they actually need. And in a way, it's also paradoxical because the Ukrainians, which now have a lot more experience with this kind of war, are being trained by Western militaries that have fundamentally far less experience than the Ukrainians do. So in that way, it perhaps doesn't even make that much sense. What's your view on that?
I think that the training that Western militaries can provide is often quite relevant. There are small tactical aspects where the Ukrainians who have experience will have views on how drills should be adapted, and that should absolutely be integrated into training. But the training that's provided in the West is pretty good. The training that the West conducts at higher echelon is something where actually the Ukrainians don't have a huge amount of experience operating at scale. And so there is value and information that can be exchanged in both directions. So I don't buy the argument that, the West doesn't have something to offer. But there are a number of problems that emerge. One of them, and this is, I think, where the Ukrainians, their response is often to say, you're not training realistically. The way I would put it is rather that if you're on a German, British training area and there are safety standards that say that somebody has to have met a certain threshold of capability before you start integrating certain tools because of the risk of them misapplying those tools. The more tools you try and use simultaneously, the more dangerous it gets, right? If you only have a really limited amount of time to train someone, we can't get the Ukrainian troops to a level of certification in the first module in order for us to introduce the things from the second module at the same time. The political consequences of a Ukrainian and a trainer being run over by a vehicle or, killed by a grenade or whatever on our training areas would be very severe. Therefore, getting permission to use some of those things in training is not there. I think many of the Ukrainian officers who rotate in and observe this basically look at it and say, well, your training's not relevant because you're not introducing the risks of artillery, you're not throwing live grenades, you're not doing all of these things, which as soon as this person reaches their unit, they are going to need to do. Now in Ukraine, they do layer all of that into training, but then there's also a much higher rate of injury and accident during training. And so that's kind of a difference in terms of countries that are at war and countries that are not, right? But there is a more fundamental difference, and that is that Western trainers do not have the engagement with the brigade commander and the deputy brigade commander that they need if they're outside of Ukraine. And the result is that either you've trained a battalion of guys, they go, and then the brigade commander who receives those guys doesn't understand their drills, wants them to work in a way which coheres with their force, and so not applying procedures and processes that essentially unpick a lot of the training that was done. Or you end up with a situation where the collective training piece that deputy brigade commander puts on is actually not very compatible with what the unit has learned outside of Ukraine. And then, of course, again, the perception of the Ukrainian officers as these people aren't ready. Actually, the training may have been quite good, but if it's preparing them to fight in a way which doesn't align with how the armed forces of Ukraine operate, because the trainers in the West don't know what that is, then it doesn't line up properly. I appreciate this is becoming a very long answer, but I think it's important to go through the details. The other challenge, and this is where the French proposal is quite interesting, is that, we struggle to envisage or understand the scale of this war, right? What it means to be fighting with 500,000 troops, because that's larger than pretty much any NATO force. And so a lot of the offers of training in Europe, there is a huge timeline to get those people away from the front, out of Ukraine, and to bring their equipment, which, to be honest, just hasn't happened. It can't really be done. The Ukrainians need the equipment in Ukraine at the front. Rotating it's very difficult. The rules around transporting it are complicated. And so there's a challenge in making the training realistic when you don't have enough people at the site and you don't have their equipment and you're having to use substitute things. Whereas if the training is in Ukraine, then there is a better chance that the Ukrainians can maintain a training fleet of vehicles at the site, and that they can rotate the people and bring them through in a sufficient volume. And that's why I think there's a discussion about training in country, because it may be able to meet the scale demand, and it also may enable some of those permissions problems to unlock. But, we shouldn't underestimate how big a step that is. Having declared forces in Ukraine is not a trivial matter for any of Ukraine's international partners.
I think getting back to the point of the balance of power on the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine, to follow up on what you've said previously, you said that Russia is compounding advantages against Ukraine because it's able to keep up a sustained pressure against Ukrainian forces. And you also wrote in one of your articles that Russia's aim in Ukraine is not a grand breakthrough of its lines, but rather convincing Ukraine that Russia will just inevitably keep gaining more and more territory. But one argument against that, or the issue that I see there, is that if you look at how high the Russian losses are in terms of personnel and equipment losses, it just doesn't seem like a sustainable strategy in mid or long term? Because to me, it just seems that with this rate of losses on Russian side, they would just run out of their equipment, and they would lose equipment and soldiers faster than they can regenerate them before they would actually gain some kind of a meaningful amount of territory or any major targets. In other words, they would run out of their army before they get to Kiev or even to Kharkiv.
So I think, firstly, people are often pushing numbers around that are not particularly accurate. And so people's understanding of the rates of attrition is not necessarily entirely correct. There's also a lack of granular detail in a lot of the numbers that are pushed around, even if they are accurate, as to the proportion of killed and wounded are wounded but recoverable as personnel, or the balance of who was killed, right? And therefore, how severe of a problem that actually was. I'll give you an example. Around 85 to 86% of the Wagner losses in Bakhmut were mobilized prisoners, right? Who had a couple of weeks training. And actual trained soldiers, Russian losses were around 20 to 40 a week in Bakhmut. So that did not significantly degrade the capability of the Russian armed forces, right? Because these were people that the Russians, they think about this very differently to us, but they didn't necessarily have a problem losing them. The other thing that I think we have to bear in mind here is that the Russian group of forces has continued to expand throughout the conflict, or at least since the initial wave of mobilization. They went into Ukraine with around 150,000 troops. There were additional levies in Luhansk and Donetsk in the occupied areas that brought that up to around 220,000 troops, but that was the expendable margin that the Russians didn't mind using for dirty work. Their force then went through mobilization, but then after that very messy period of mobilization, they built a deliberate force generation and training cycle. And we've now seen Russian group of forces expand to around 420,000 this time last year. It was around 450,000 by August last year. It was around 470,000 in February this year. It's currently around 510,000 troops. And that increase has happened with all the losses that they've been taking, and they are exceeding their own recruitment targets. And in terms of the impact in Russia, it hasn't been very heavily felt. So actually, no, the Russians can sustain the rate of personnel losses. That doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect on the force, right? So the losses that they are sustaining of officers have had a much more detrimental effect on their ability to conduct any kind of operation at scale or with any complexity. Equipment losses, it's a slightly different picture, and that's why I emphasize the fact that there will be sufficient output for them to maintain this year and through a proportion of next year. And then it is likely to become harder because they will start running into shortages in their stockpiles. And once that happens, they can't refurbish equipment. It's about what they can produce. That will slow down the rate of equipment provision. And then the dynamic that you've just described becomes very real. But that doesn't mean that they can't inflict an awful lot of damage, relative damage on the Ukrainians before we hit that point, right? And so the Ukrainians are also suffering heavy equipment losses. And when you put those two things together, it becomes harder and harder for the Ukrainians to maintain the length of front that you're talking about. So, yeah.
Aren't the personnel losses on the Russian side not that important? Because Russia, I think, does have sort of this almost infinite pool of people that it can potentially either attract as volunteers or then mobilize. But if it runs out of equipment, it doesn't really have that much benefit. In other words, you can't just have a military made up of infantry, or you could, but it's probably not going to be very effective. So maybe the fact that Russia can regenerate the personnel losses matters far less than whether it's able to produce enough of armored vehicles and tanks to regenerate the numbers.
Yeah, so if we were in a situation where the Russians could not generate vehicles, you'd be correct. They're never going to be in that position, right? That they can generate a fairly significant number of armored platforms. Just in terms of new production tanks, yeah, the Russians are currently manufacturing more per year than the entire British Army is purchasing over the next decade. Okay, and that accounts for about 15% of the number of tanks they're actually putting on the battlefield each year. The remainder are refurbished, coming from storage. But the ones that are coming from storage still require quite a lot of work, right? And so when they shift the capacity from the process of refurbishment into production, the number of baseline platforms that they're producing is going to go up. So they will still be generating 2 British armies worth of tanks per year, right? By the end of when they start running out of their stores. That's not insignificant, but it is significantly less than they currently have. And so that will constrain the scale at which they can operate. It will have a negative effect on their combat power and their ability to employ the forces, as you have highlighted. But that's a factor that kicks in around late 25, early 26, right, and compounds through 26. So if the Ukrainians are still fighting in mid to late 26, they're going to benefit very substantially from the dynamics you've just described. If they're not, right, if this is concluded before then actually the Russians don't run into that problem yet.
Do we know, just out of curiosity, do we know what is that number of newly produced tanks and armored vehicles that Russia can produce? Because I think there is a lot of confusion as to how many of those are refurbished equipment pulled out of Soviet era stock, and how much of that is what Russia is actually building as new product.
Yeah, so this year they're going to produce around 1,500 tanks this year, and it will be a similar number next year. That includes refurbishment and production. In terms of production, it's around 150 to 200 new tanks.
Per year.
Per year. Then you have, in addition to that, repair. Right? And I think one of the things that we don't see much discussion of is the proportion of equipment that is recovered from the battlefield and then repaired. Because if you put a small hole in a tank using an FPV, that may not damage large parts of the tank's functioning systems. If it detonates the magazine and the turret flies off, then that's a very different story. But if it's a small explosive penetration, then you may be able to get that tank back up and running quite quickly. So that's another element, is that when you look at claimed losses of armored vehicles, not all of them are catastrophic losses.
So I think what we're talking about is basically a war of attrition. And it seems to me that war of attrition, in a way, looking at it quite cynically, is basically about maths and statistics of how much equipment do you have and how much of it are you losing, and whether you're losing it faster and do you have more of it than your opponent or not. And a key part of this equation to me is what is the ratio of losses between the two sides, and how has that been changing throughout the course of the war. But at the same time, that is one piece of information that I think isn't really talked much about, and it's very hard to find some meaningful information on that. Do we know what is that ratio actually, in terms of either personnel losses or equipment losses between Russia and Ukraine, and whether that has been shifting during the different stages of the war, or whether it stayed more or less stable?
So yes, that data exists. It's classified in Ukraine, and it's illegal to release without authorization from the state. And there's very, very good reasons for that, right? So if the Ukrainians get into the habit of saying, we have now taken X number of casualties, then the Russians will be able to measure their effect after any given operation, and that's very useful data. It also starts to, because you can look at which units you were in contact with over the period of time, it allows the Russians to start measuring the readiness of different Ukrainian brigades, and then focus where they apply pressure based on which units are most depleted. So the Ukrainians have very, very good reasons for not releasing that data. and those people who hold that data are, it's shared with the trust that then won't be published, which is why we have this dynamic where everyone's trading numbers on Russian losses, some of which are more accurate than others, but we don't have a public discussion about Ukrainian losses. And that limits people's understanding of what's happening. Losses throughout the war have not been steady state. They haven't been, a trickle of the same numbers throughout. There are particular operations, particular axes, which have become far more costly at particular times. And if you went and looked at where the most intense fighting was or where the Russian main efforts were, you would probably be able to draw a pretty accurate view of exactly where those points were. But yeah, this has not been a low cost conflict, right, for either side. On the point about attritional war, I'd just emphasize that there isn't a dichotomy or a difference between maneuver warfare and attritional warfare. All warfare is attritional. The question is your theory of victory premised on simply inflicting more damage than the other side? As a defeat mechanism, that is a very particular logic to enter into, and it usually favors the larger party. All warfare is attritional. The whole point of maneuver or a positional approach to warfare is to maximize the lopsidedness of the attrition, right? So that you can't buy out a requirement for more equipment, more rounds, more personnel. What you do with them, how you employ them, fine, you've got a lot of options, and that will have a huge impact on the outcome of the conflict. But the idea that you can trade out the attritional nature of conflict is, I think, a very dangerous premise.
Since you've mentioned it, let's talk about the theory of victory for Ukraine, because it seems like for Russia, it's not that much of an issue, but I would say that's probably still, it has the maximalist goals, and it's still attempting to dissuade allies from supporting Ukraine and then defeating Ukraine militarily. But for Ukraine, I think that's more of a complicated question at this point. And I would link it to the mobilization that's ongoing. And because one of the issues with the mobilization that I've heard about is that what makes it quite hard to mobilize people or to convince people to join is that at this point, there is no clear end of the war in sight. So the idea is that if you join, you will kind of have to keep fighting this war of attrition for an indefinite amount of time until it's somehow ends, which understandably is not as appealing as when there was an idea that Ukraine will do a major counteroffensive and then it will push Russia out of its territory. So I wonder, in your view, how do you resolve this issue, and how can whether perhaps Ukraine should have some kind of a unified public strategy of how it can win the war and that it can offer to its people?
So I think the Ukrainian objective is quite easy to articulate, which is to bring about a lasting peace, right? In which Ukraine is an independent, sovereign country. And the emphasis has to be on the word lasting. And this is why people who argue, well, we just have a ceasefire and then we have peace, right, are very dangerous, because they are setting conditions whereby Ukraine is left economically ruined. No one has the confidence to put money in for its reconstruction, politically divided, and where it's unprotected from Russia simply resetting and then coming again because Russian objectives have not changed. And then that's not a lasting peace. And any Ukrainian government that tries to create peace on those terms will fracture the Ukrainian political community, because people will not see that as a viable deal. So the question then becomes, how do we create conditions whereby the peace will last and Ukraine can maintain its sovereignty? A part of that is going to have to be security guarantees from Ukraine's international partners, because they're going to have to be more believable security guarantees than the Budapest Memorandum, right? Because without that, Ukraine by itself is very unlikely to be able to deter Russia in the long term. At the moment, countries have not articulated what they would be prepared to do in terms of offering those guarantees. And so until Ukraine has an outline from its international partners as to what that proposition is, it doesn't have a negotiating position because it can't accept a ceasefire. Once you're in the position where those security guarantees give Ukraine confidence that if there was a freezing of the conflict, it would remain frozen, then the question becomes what level of territory needs to be recaptured before Ukraine is economically viable. It's quite an important question. Another really important question is how do you convince the Russians that they actually want to negotiate an end to the conflict at that point? At the moment, the Russians think they can win. So they're not interested in making any kind of concessions. However, if this, from a Russian point of view, looks like it's going to become an indefinite conflict, looks like the rate of equipment loss is going to start actually eating into the deployed vehicle fleet, if they think that the regime is going to be more vulnerable over time because the economic situation is deteriorating substantially, which, again, in the short term, they can handle. In the long term, they're building up a lot of problems, right? And so if this protracts, then that equation becomes less certain. Then actually the Russians may feel that they want to claim a victory and therefore acknowledge a cessation of the conflict at a certain point. And then it becomes a question of who has more leverage and the diplomatic, negotiating positions advanced by both parties. But we're not there yet. We're a very long way away from that because, as I say, the West hasn't articulated any security guarantees to Ukraine that it can put on the table. The Ukrainians don't have that coercive leverage to bring the Russians to the negotiating table, and the Russians think they can win. And so they only want to discuss a ceasefire in order to weaken Ukraine and isolate it from its international partners, which means that the challenge, to get back to your question, for Zelensky and for Ukrainian politicians is that because they don't own all of the variables, it's quite difficult for them to lay out what that path to victory looks like. So it needs to be articulated, but it needs to be articulated not just by the Ukrainian government, but the Ukrainian government with its international partners standing behind it.
Well, it seems to me like sort of under the surface, the theory of victory right now is that if Ukraine, as you've kind of said, if Ukraine holds long enough until late next year, early 2026, by then for Russia, the math of the invasion of the resources it has put into and it would have to keep putting into where versus what it was able to get out of it would start making less and less sense, and it would perhaps be forced to reconsider. But it seems to me like that is sort of the idea that everyone is operating with, but at the same time it's not really an idea you can, if you're Zelensky, you can state publicly, because then you would be putting out hopes out there for for specific dates that you can't really promise. Is that perhaps the case?
I mean, we've run into this problem before, right? Where Zelensky had talked about achieving the liberation of the occupied territories by the end of this year. This was last year. And when the Ukrainian offensive failed last year, that public commitment that Zelensky had made was not viable. Just militarily was not going to be viable. But how the Ukrainian government articulated the fact that that was no longer viable while maintaining public confidence in the AFU and in the government and all those things was challenging. And so there are real dangers to putting firm dates out there and commitments like that. The other problem, of course, is that the second you put out a date or a firm commitment or a clear objective in the public domain, the Russians can optimize to make that as costly and as difficult or as non-viable as possible, because they suddenly have something that you have publicly fixed yourself against that they can then manipulate. Declaring Fortress Bakhmut, for example, meant that reputationally the Ukrainian government had fixed itself into defending Bakhmut. And so the Russians could then concentrate on creating conditions in Bakhmut that really hurt the armed forces of Ukraine. So we have to be very cognizant of the fact that the enemy is listening. And under those conditions, you can't make arbitrary commitments because they very quickly become tangible, and if you haven't thought it through, they become extremely costly.
One more thing I'd like to dig into is what you've said about the lasting peace as the ultimate objective that Ukraine has to strive for. And I'm wondering to what extent that is really a realistic objective, because that would, I assume, sort of require either for Russia to not exist in its current state and with its current leadership and trajectory, or for Ukraine to be in NATO, which is the only guarantee in the world today that seems to really matter. And none of those look like very realistic scenarios. So wouldn't it sort of make more sense to prepare? And I know it probably sounds horrible, and probably it sounds horrible for Ukrainians, but to prepare for a pause between this war in which both parties will try to regenerate as much as they can, and then at some point the expectation that Russia will try to attempt something like this again. And I think that sort of perhaps points to the stated strategy of Ukraine, stated by Zelensky, of turning Ukraine into a big Israel, as he put it. So basically, a country that is not part of an alliance that has to defend itself, but it has enormous support from partners, and it's militarized to a really high degree.
If the Ukrainians want to go down that route, then they need economic transformation, right? I mean, the big challenge becomes resourcing and money. And they're talking about more money than if there isn't an actual war and there isn't therefore an immediate threat to Europe, then Ukraine's international partners can probably politically sustain handing over. So I think it's not just, Ukraine can handle this on its own. That's quite a dangerous, it's a nice idea, but it's not realistic. In terms of the willingness of Ukraine's international partners to provide that support, if you look at where NATO is at the moment, NATO is anticipating the need to be able to deter Russia conventionally before the end of the decade, right? But the emphasis there is on deterrence. And that's why you can still have a lasting peace, even if, as you say, the Russians reset and still have hostile intent. Because if you can create conditions whereby they don't think that conventionally they can achieve their objectives, when that second opportunity comes around, then you deter them from trying. And so the real question is, it's interesting, there isn't actually a trade-off between NATO rearmament and Ukraine's survival, right? A lot of people seem to look at it and say, if you donate equipment to Ukraine, it's not it's actually reducing NATO's conventional capacity. The reality is the frontline capabilities in most NATO land forces is heavily depleted anyway. Production capacity matters a lot more. And we have the time so that if production capacity today goes into supporting the Ukrainian armed forces, next year, the year after, it can start going into A, regenerating NATO forces, but B, contributing to the resilience, the magazine depth, the industrial capacity to have a credible deterrent, so that when countries in NATO make those security guarantees to Ukraine, they're credible. So there are a lot of moving parts to that equation, right? It's not an easy journey, but it's also not impossible. One of the biggest challenges, actually, this is obviously something that's difficult to, people struggle to discuss, is that if you look at this from a Russian point of view, a lot of Russians today, I think, take the view that this is a very bad situation, but it will only get better when they win the war, right? And so they have to see it through. And they think that a lot of the pain that they are experiencing is not a result of the war, but a result of the West attacking Russia or using measures to undermine Russia. So we're in a situation where very, very few Russians, that they can see the damage of what's being done, but they can't see a better outcome for them if they stop. And we haven't articulated what that is. That's a real challenge, because it means that the Russians, they see the downsides, but they also don't see the opportunity for a different trajectory. And so under those conditions, you almost guarantee that there'll be a sustained threat. And the extent of that threat is then determined by whether or not the Russians can realize their objectives militarily. But we have to shift that calculus.
Moving from the strategic perspective that we were talking about, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the operational level of the war. And I'd like to hear your view on the Russian offensive in Kharkiv. Do you see it from your perspective as a Russian failure?
So the Russians assembled about 40,000 troops in the Belgorod direction. They didn't commit them all, and so they maintain the capacity to open up some new axes if they feel that they should, or to come again against Kharkiv. And because they hold those reserves, the threat remains extant. The purpose of the original incursion was to make a push towards Kharkiv because they knew that if they could get within artillery range of Kharkiv, they would deliver a pretty devastating political blow to Ukraine by depopulating the city. And therefore, they forced the Ukrainians to have to defend forward, to have to come to them. The Russians at a tactical level did not achieve as much of an incursion or make as many gains as they wanted. But what they did succeed in doing was pulling in a lot of the Ukrainian reserves, which was the objective of the operation. And so the Russians can't use the whole group of forces against Kharkiv because if they want to fix those Ukrainian reserves, now that the front has become slightly more stable, then they need to maintain the latent capacity to continue the operation, which means that they need to hold a significant proportion of the original force back in Belgorod. But that is what they've done. Pulling those reserves in means that those reserves are no longer available to plug gaps elsewhere in the line. And what you have seen is that the Russians have continued to make progress on a number of axes further in the south, and they are setting the conditions to have that be their main effort later this summer. So operationally, I think the Kharkiv direction has been successful for the Russians in terms of it achieving the intent of the operation. Particularly, they have less territory under control on the Ukrainian side of the border than they would have liked. And, the Ukrainian counterattacks have been relatively effective. They've inflicted quite significant damage on the Russian forces involved. And the fact that they got permission to strike over the Russian border reduced some of the structural advantages that the Russians thought they could employ to significantly increase the Ukrainian rate of attrition in that fight. So it's an ongoing situation.
I think one of the issues with this is that it forces Ukrainian armed forces to be overstretched along the front lines. Mike Kaufman recently said that because of that, the biggest issue that Ukraine is dealing with at this point, by far, is the lack of manpower. But that seems like something that should be in coming weeks and perhaps months, could be improved with the new wave of mobilization that Ukraine is going through right now. Would you agree with that assessment?
So I think there are three challenges. The first is battlefield replacements, bringing existing units up to strength. The second is forming new units that can guard the axes off the main effort so that the Russians don't have any easy directions that they can push in and stretch out the Ukrainians. The third element is regenerating offensive combat power, actually being able to threaten the Russians. And to do that, the Ukrainians need quite a lot more equipment. So, if you're going to conduct offensive operations, exactly what you was describing before, right? It's not worth having the people if you don't have the equipment for them to use because they can't fulfill their mission. Whereas if we're talking about guarding the border and blocking positions, then the level of equipment required is less. But the other issue is that there is this tempo question of when the troops arrive. There is an immediate shortage of personnel, which requires battlefield replacements. Those people need to be pushed in immediately, but they are not going to increase the combat capability of the units they join, right? They are going to be less experienced, less well-trained than the people that they are working alongside. And those units are not going to be cohered. They will gain cohesion through the defense that they're conducting, but they will not gain cohesion sufficient to be able to conduct battalion or brigade offensive action. And in order to do that third piece, you need people who are held back off the line and are force generated deliberately and given time to do the training and the rehearsal. And so the Ukrainians need to line up those three things simultaneously because they have different lead times. And the risk is that they fill the first problem by draining the second and the third pools. And if they do that, then we will see a larger problem later in the year. So the Ukrainian mobilization law is one part of the equation, but there is the training and the equipment pipeline, which is equally important if we think about this in terms of the operational level and the impact on the war, rather than just the current tactical situation, which Mike is characterizing, I think, very accurately, where there is a serious shortage of manpower.
So you said, to sort of finish this section on the war in Ukraine, you said in May that you see the outlook for Ukraine for the future as very bleak. And I wonder, it seems to me, I was going to ask if you still see it as bleak, but it sounds like you do. But so I would ask that, and also, what do you expect to happen what do you expect to happen in the rest of the year, and what can Ukraine and its allies do to make the situation as favorable to Ukraine as possible?
I do see the situation as quite bleak. I think that the release of the US aid package has bought time. The question is what is done with that time. And if you want to turn the situation around, then there are some decisions that need to be made pretty much this summer. Partly it's about expansion of industrial output and rationalization of production, proper division of labor, proper supply chain coherence in NATO, which we need to do for the sake of NATO's defense posture, but it directly benefits Ukraine. That ensures that there is sufficient equipment. Then there is the question of training and force generation. And there is a part of that, which is the mobilization piece, that we can't solve. That's for the Ukrainians to resolve. The piece about the training is something that we have to resolve in collaboration with the Ukrainians. The French proposition may well provide a good pathway to doing that. But those are conversations that will be happening, I think, during the NATO summit. And then after the NATO summit, we will see what states are prepared to do. The risk is that we repeat the errors that we have made previously in this conflict, whereby we talk for a very long time about doing things, but leave the execution too long, such that by the time we start implementing, it's too late to have the desired effect. And if we do that, then the situation and the trajectory will be very negative. So we don't have a huge amount of time, because if you want to maintain Ukrainian troop levels, uplift industrial production at the pace where that increase is necessary, so that the output is there when you need it, then you need to be making those decisions this summer.
So I could talk about this a lot longer and keep picking your brain, because it's really interesting. But we do have another section of our conversation that I wanted to move to, and that's moving from the overt war that's happening to the more covert, shadowy side of it, since you have also worked and wrote on Russian unconventional warfare against the West and around the globe. And that's something of which we have seen a lot more ever since you have written your report in February this year all across Europe. So can you explain what is Russia doing? What kind of measures is it using, and what is it actually trying to achieve with all these subversive measures and this covert war that's going on? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests. And here's what you can see in the bonus part.
The irony is that Using lethal force against the Russians can actually be a de-escalatory action because they don't value human life. They see it as a component of negotiation. That the Russian special services were not as blind to this problem as we sometimes make out. They were briefing the Kremlin that the preconditions for the invasion had not been met, that they needed more time. And Putin decided to go ahead. And there were an awful lot of people who were prepared to take Russian money and to do tasks for the Russian special services who worked in the Ukrainian government. A very large number of people who were quite happy to take their money, quite happy to do everyday tasks for them, decided that actually I don't like the fact that you're bombing my grandmother's village and I'm not talking to you anymore.